My hands stopped over his chest, and I could not move them. There was a folded paper in the inner pocket of the jacket I had just buttoned over a boy who had been dead for 2 days. 2 days. And the paper had my name on it. Not his family's name, not a prayer. My name, written in a hand I had never seen, on a body I had been hired to dress for burial. I stood in that mortuary room in Monza, and I felt every sound leave me. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. For 3 years after that, I could barely speak above a whisper. Doctors found nothing wrong with my throat. My name is Renata Bianchi. I was a seamstress and a dresser of the dead for 31 years, working out of a small atelier near the cemetery in Monza, in the north of Italy. Families brought me their loved ones' clothes, and I made them fit again, because death changes the shape of a person, and a mother does not want to bury her child in a jacket that hangs wrong. I did not believe in much. I believed in thread, in measurements, in the weight of good wool. I went to Mass at Christmas and Easter the way you visit a relative you love but rarely call. I lived alone above the workshop with a cat named Bottone and a radio that was always on. That was the whole of me before October of 2006. A woman who fixed seams and kept her hands busy so her mind would stay quiet. What I found in that pocket, and what a mother told me 14 years later about a sentence her son spoke before he died, took everything I thought I understood about ordinary life and broke it open. I have stayed silent about all of it. The few times I tried to tell it, my voice failed me at the exact same sentence, every time. Today, for the first time, I am going to say all of it out loud. Every measurement, every impossible thing. The call came on the 14th of October, 2 days after the boy died. It was a Saturday morning, and the fog had not lifted off the streets near San Gerardo Hospital. The phone in my workshop rang while I was pinning a hem on a black dress for a widow's funeral set for that afternoon. I almost did not answer. I had 2 jobs already that day, and Bottone had knocked a spool of gray thread under the cutting table, and I was on my knees reaching for it when the ringing would not stop. The voice on the line was a man from the funeral home I worked with most often, a place run by the Caremoli family. He spoke quickly, the way people do when they are nervous and trying to sound calm. There was a young man, he said, 15 years old. He had died of leukemia at San Gerardo on the 12th. The family had specific wishes. They wanted him dressed simply, in the clothes he actually wore. Jeans, a pair of Nike trainers, a dark jacket, a sweater. Nothing formal, nothing bought for the occasion. I wrote it down on the back of an envelope. Jeans, trainers, jacket. I remember thinking it was unusual, but not impossible. People grieve in their own ways. Some bury their dead in tuxedos, and some in the pajamas they last slept in. Then the man said the thing that made me set down my pencil. The family did not want the body altered in any way. No heavy cosmetics, no reshaping. They wanted him to look like himself. And there was a particular request, passed down from the mother, that I treat the boy with great care. Because, the man said, lowering his voice, the family believed the boy was holy. I had dressed perhaps 400 bodies by then. I had heard families say their dead were angels, saints, the best souls who ever lived. Grief says these things. I did not think anything of the word holy, beyond the ache behind it. I agreed. I packed my kit, needles, the strong waxed thread, my good scissors, the small steel measuring tape I had carried for 20 years, and a thermometer I sometimes used in cold rooms to check whether a body had been kept properly chilled. I drove the short distance through the fog to the mortuary annex where they had brought him. The boy was on a steel table under a single light. Someone had combed his hair. He was tall for his age, with a round, soft face that still looked like a child's. And the first thing I noticed, before any measurement, before I had even unrolled my kit, was that there was something wrong with the room. It was warm. The cooling unit was running. I could hear it. I could see the gauge. but the air near the table did not match the gauge, and I could not yet say why. I told myself it was the fog, the bad insulation of an old building. I went to work. I laid out his clothes, the family had sent in a paper bag. Jeans, washed soft, a blue sweater, a dark jacket, the Nike trainers, scuffed at the toe the way a living boy scuffs them. And I began the work I had done 1,000 times, the careful, respectful work of dressing someone who can no longer help you do it. But the jacket did not lie flat the way a jacket should over a body 2 days gone. And in the breast of it, on the inside, I felt something through the lining. A small, stiff square of folded paper. I left it there. I told myself I would deal with it after. I had no idea yet that it was waiting for me by name. The strangeness of the warmth would not leave me alone. I have worked in cold rooms my whole adult life. I know what a body feels like at 12 hours, at 24, at 48. I know the particular firmness of the muscles when rigor has come and gone, the way the skin cools and changes, the way the limbs resist you. It is not pleasant to describe, but it is my trade, and I am precise about it, because precision is the only respect I have to give. This boy was not behaving the way 2 days of death behaves. His hands were soft, not stiff. When I lifted his arm to slide it into the sweater sleeve, it moved with me, easily, the way a sleeping person's arm moves. There was no resistance. At 48 hours after death, there should have been the lingering stiffness of rigor, only just releasing, and beneath that, the chill of a body kept at refrigeration temperature, which is around 4 degrees Celsius. I took out my thermometer. I told myself I was being foolish, but I pressed it to the skin of his forearm and I waited. The reading came back at 26 degrees Celsius. I stared at it. 26 degrees. That is the temperature of a cool room, not a body that has been refrigerated for 2 days. A body left at room temperature reaches the temperature of the room within roughly a day. A refrigerated body should read close to the cooling unit, near 4 degrees. There was no version of the arithmetic where a boy dead 2 days, kept in a running cooler, read 26 degrees in his forearm. I thought the thermometer was broken. It was an old one. I shook it, the way you shake something that has failed you, even though that does nothing for a digital reading. I pressed it to my own wrist to test it. It read 36.4, exactly where my own living temperature should be. The instrument was fine, so I pressed it back to the boy. 26.1 this time. I moved it to his neck, closer to the core, where a body holds its heat longest. 29 degrees. That was worse. That was so much worse. Because the core reading, 2 days after death in a cooler, should have been the coldest comfort of all. Instead, it was climbing toward the warmth of the living. I set the thermometer down on the steel tray, and I heard it rattle, and I realized my hand was shaking. I am not a woman who frightens easily. I have been alone with the dead in the middle of the night more times than I can count, and the dead have never frightened me, because the dead are simply gone, and what is gone cannot hurt you. But this boy was not behaving like someone who was gone, and I did not have a word yet for what he was behaving like. I made myself keep working. I told myself a story about a faulty cooling unit, about a thermometer with a glitch I had not caught, about my own tiredness. I slid his arm into the sweater. I straightened the collar. And as I leaned close to do it, I caught the scent of the room, and the story I was telling myself fell apart in my hands. There was no smell. A body 2 days dead has begun its work. Even refrigerated, even cared for, there is a particular sweetness underneath, the first faint note of what comes. Any dresser of the dead knows it the way a baker knows the smell of yeast. It is always there. It was not there. What I smelled instead, faintly, near his hair and his hands, was something like flowers. Not perfume. The family had asked for no cosmetics, and I had applied none. something cleaner than perfume, something I could not place and did not want to name. I stepped back from the table. I went to the door and I opened it, and I breathed the foggy outside air for a full minute, and then I made myself go back in, because I had a job to finish and a family who was trusting me, and because some stubborn part of me refused to run from a 15-year-old boy. I finished dressing him. The jeans, the trainers I laced the way I imagined he had laced them, and then, last, the jacket, and the square of folded paper inside it pressed against my fingers again, and this time I could not pretend it was nothing. I reached into the inner pocket and I drew it out. It was a single sheet, folded into quarters, the paper slightly yellowed, as if it had been carried a while. On the outside of the fold, in blue ink, in a careful, rounded hand, were words I read 3 times before I believed them. The words were, "For the woman who dresses me. Do not open this yet." I want to be exact about what happened in my body in that moment, because it is the closest I have ever come to understanding what people mean when they say their blood ran cold. There was no way the boy could have known me. He had died on the 12th. The funeral home had not chosen me until the morning of the 14th. The decision of who would dress him had been made 48 hours after he was already dead by a man on a telephone, almost at random, because I was the dresser they used most. And yet here was a note, in the boy's pocket, in what I would later learn was the boy's own handwriting, addressed to the woman who dressed him. "Do not open this yet." I held that paper, and I felt the room tilt. The cooling unit hummed. The single light buzzed. And I understood, in a way I could not yet explain to anyone, that I had walked into something that did not obey the rules I had built my whole sensible life upon. I did not open it. God help me, I do not fully know why I obeyed a dead boy, except that the instruction was so calm, so certain, that disobeying it felt like a violence I was not willing to commit. I folded the note back along its creases, and I held it in my closed fist. And I finished my work, and I left that room a different woman than the one who had entered it. I would carry that paper, unopened, for 14 years. I drove home through the fog, and I did not turn on the radio. When I reached my workshop, I sat in the car in the cold for a long time, the note in my coat pocket, Batoni watching me through the window above. I tried to be rational. I am a rational woman. I built the rational explanations one by one, and one by one, they failed. The warmth. Faulty equipment, I told myself. But I had tested the thermometer on my own wrist, and it had read true. And a running cooler does not warm a body to 29 degrees at the core. It cannot. The physics runs the other way. The smell. My imagination, I told myself. But I had 31 years of training in exactly that smell, and its absence was not imagination. It was data, a missing thing I had never once known to be missing. The note. A trick, I told myself. Someone had planted it. But who would write, "For the woman who dresses me," before anyone alive knew who that woman would be? Every door I tried to walk through slammed shut, and behind every slammed door was the same impossible fact, growing larger each time I returned to it. If what I had measured was real, then what I had dressed was not behaving like a dead body at all. That night I did something I had not done since I was a girl. I knelt by my bed, with my knees aching on the wood floor, and I tried to pray, and I found I did not remember how. I knelt there anyway, in the dark, holding the folded paper, until the cold drove me under the blankets. I did not yet know the boy's name. I want you to understand that. At that point, on the night of the 14th, I knew only that a 15-year-old had died of leukemia, and that his family thought him holy, and that he had left a note for a stranger he could not have known. The name would come the next morning, from a newspaper, and the name would be the second time my blood ran cold. But before that, in the small hours, I did the only thing I could think to do with my fear. I took out my measuring tape, my old steel tape, and I wrote down on the back of the same envelope every number I had recorded: 26.1, 29, the release of rigor that should not have released, the flowers, the silence of a body that should have been speaking the language of decay. I dated it, the 14th of October, 2006. I did not know why I was making a record. I think some part of me already understood that one day I would need to prove to myself that I had not gone mad. And I had not gone mad. That was the terrible thing. Everything I wrote down was true. The next morning, I bought a newspaper, and the boy's face was on an inside page, and the headline used a word I have never been able to forget. The article called him a candidate for sainthood. Carlo Acutis, 15 years old, born in London to Italian parents, raised in Milan, dead of a violent leukemia they called M3. A boy who, the article said, had built a website cataloging Eucharistic miracles from all over the world. A boy who loved computers and football, and who had told his mother more than once that the Eucharist was his highway to heaven. I sat at my kitchen table with the paper flat in front of me and the coffee going cold, and I read it 4 times. Carlo Acutis. The name meant nothing to me, and yet I could not stop reading it. They had already begun speaking of him as someone the church might one day raise to the altars. People were saying his body had a peace about it. People were saying things had happened around him. And I thought of the warmth, 29 degrees at the core. I thought of the missing smell. I thought of the soft, unresisting arm sliding into the sweater. And I thought of the folded paper in my coat pocket, addressed to me, before anyone knew I existed in this story. And I felt the whole solid world I had stood on for 50 years go thin as paper beneath my feet. I told no one. Who would I tell? What would I say? That I had taken the temperature of a dead boy and it was wrong? They would have taken my work from me. A dresser who imagines warmth in corpses does not get called again. So I locked the note in the small drawer of my sewing table, where I kept my mother's thimble and a few coins, and I went back to work, and I tried to become again the woman who believed only in thread. It did not hold. The next week, something happened in the workshop that pulled the whole thing wide open again, and this time there was a witness. Her name was Julia, and she was the granddaughter of the Caremeli man who ran the funeral home, a serious girl of perhaps 22, who had come to learn the trade because, she said, someone in every generation had to. She helped me sometimes with the heavy lifting and the deliveries. On the 21st of October, she came to bring me a black coat for alteration, and she stayed for coffee. And somewhere in the middle of it, she went quiet, and then she said a strange thing. She said, "That boy from last week, the Acutis boy, did you notice anything?" I kept my eyes on my cup. I asked her what she meant. She said her grandfather had moved the body twice, once into the cooler and once out for the dressing, and that both times he had come back pale and would not talk about it. And she said that she herself had gone into the cooler to fetch something the morning before I arrived, and that the boy's hands had been folded, and that she had touched one to move it, and that it had been warm. I set my cup down very carefully so that it would not rattle. "Warm," I said. She nodded. "Warm," she said, "like a hand that is sleeping." And she had told no one, she said, because who would believe her? And she had thought she was losing her mind, until she saw my face just now and understood that I had felt it too. I will not pretend I was not relieved. To be alone with an impossible thing is its own kind of madness. To have it confirmed by another person, an independent person who had touched him on a different day, in a different hour, before I had ever entered the building, changed the shape of it entirely. Because now it was not one faulty thermometer and one tired woman. It was 2 witnesses, 2 separate days, the same impossible warmth. Julia had felt it on the 13th. I had measured it on the 14th. 29 degrees at the core, 2 days after a death. If this story has reached some quiet place in you, the place where you carry the people you have lost and the prayers you do not always know how to say, I want to give you something before I go on. I have prepared a novena to Carlo Acutis, completely free, inspired by his devotion to the Eucharist, so that you can pray it for whatever you are carrying right now. It is in the description, the first link right below this video. Download it and pray it over 9 days for someone you love. But before I can tell you why I am asking you this, here, at this exact moment in the story, I have to tell you what I discovered the following week, when I finally let myself look closely at the note. I did not open it. I keep saying that, and I need you to keep believing it, because it matters to what comes later. But I did look at the outside of it again, under good light, with the magnifying glass I use for fine stitching. And on the back fold, in the same blue ink, smaller, almost hidden in a crease, were more words I had not seen in the dim mortuary, words I had to read several times under the lens before they resolved. They said, "You will be afraid of your own hands. Do not be. They are clean." I sat very still for a long time. I am a woman who works with her hands. They are the most important things I own. And in the days since the dressing, I had, in fact, become afraid of them, without quite admitting it to myself. I had washed them too often. I had caught myself staring at them in the lamplight. The boy, somehow, had known I would. He had known the precise shape my fear would take, and he had named it on a slip of paper folded into his own jacket before any of it happened. I will tell you plainly that I considered in those weeks that I was simply unwell, that grief or strain had bent my mind. I went so far as to see a doctor in Monza, a sensible man named Dr. Ferry, and I told him only the smallest piece, that I had been having trouble sleeping and that my voice was sometimes failing me. He examined my throat. He found nothing. He told me my vocal cords were perfectly healthy and that whatever silenced me was not in my body. Not in my body. I left his office and stood on the pavement with that phrase ringing in me. If it was not in my body, where was it? I went back to the workshop, and I took out the envelope where I had recorded the temperatures, and I added a new entry, because I am a woman who keeps records, and because the record was the only solid ground I had left. I wrote down the date. I wrote down the words from the back of the note. And then, almost without deciding to, I wrote down a question. What if everything the boy wrote is true? I had never asked that question about anything in my life. I had measured the world. I had not let it speak to me. And now a dead 15-year-old was speaking to me through folded paper and through warmth that violated physics. And I was beginning, against every habit of my mind, to listen. There was one more thing in those weeks, and it is the thing I have told no living person until now. I began to dream of a hospital I did not recognize. Not San Gerardo, a different one, brighter, with a long window full of light and a particular shade of pale green on the walls. And in the dream, I was on my knees on a hard floor, the way I had been on my knees by my bed, and there was a sense of someone beside me, patient and unhurried, and a voice that was not loud, telling me that I would understand when I came here. When I came here. As if the hospital in the dream were a place I had not yet been, but would. I dreamed it 3 nights running. I wrote that down too, because by then I wrote everything down. A hospital, pale green walls, a long window, the number on a door, which in the dream I could almost read and never quite could. Something with a 4 in it. I did not know then that the dream was not a dream in the ordinary sense. I did not know that it was an appointment. But I am getting ahead of myself, and the next thing I must tell you is what happened when I finally went looking for who Carlo Acutis had been, because that search led me, eventually, to his mother, and to a sentence she spoke that stopped my breath in my chest. If you downloaded that free novena I mentioned, you already understand the kind of thing I am trying to say. If you have not yet, it is still there, the first link in the description, and you can pray it for whoever in your life needs it most. And if these stories, the true ones, the ones that do not fit, mean something to you. This is the place where I keep gathering them. But what I found when I started reading about Carlos' life changed even the way I understood my own fear, and I have to tell you that next. I started, as anyone would now, on the internet. The boy had loved it. There was a kind of justice in finding him there. I learned that Carlo Acutis had been born in London on the 3rd of May, 1991, to Italian parents, and that the family had moved back to Milan when he was small. I learned that he had been an ordinary boy in the ways that matter to ordinary boys. He played football, he loved animals, he was good with computers, better than the adults around him, and he taught himself to program. But underneath the ordinary boy was something I did not have a category for. From the age of 7, when he made his first communion, he had gone to Mass nearly every day. Not because anyone made him. His parents were not especially devout. His own mother, Antonia Salzano, said openly that before Carlo, she had been to Mass perhaps 3 times in her life, and that it was her son who drew her back to faith, the child leading the mother. And he had built a website, a real one, that still exists. He had spent the last years of his short life cataloging Eucharistic miracles from across the centuries and across the world, more than 160 of them, documented, organized, mapped. He wanted people to see that the impossible had a record, that it had happened in this town and that town, with dates and places and names. He said that if people lined up for hours to see a famous painting, they should be willing to come and see the living God present in the bread of the altar. He said the Eucharist was his highway to heaven. He said it plainly, the way a boy says the thing he loves most. And then, at 15, in the autumn of 2006, he developed a violent leukemia, the kind called M3. It moved with terrible speed. He told his mother not to weep, that he was going to heaven, and that he offered all his suffering for the Pope and for the Church. He died on the 12th of October. They buried him, eventually, in Assisi, the town of the saint he loved. I read all of this over many evenings, and the more I read, the more 2 facts pressed against each other in my mind, until I could not separate them. The first fact was that this boy had spent his life collecting documented accounts of the impossible made visible in the world. The second fact was that I, a seamstress who believed only in thread, had measured the impossible with my own thermometer in his own dead body. It was as if his whole life had been an argument, and his body had become the last and clearest line of it, and I had been chosen, without my consent and without warning, to be its first witness. I needed to speak to someone who had known him. I do not entirely know how I found the courage. I am not a forward woman. But I wrote a letter, an old-fashioned paper letter, to the association that had grown up around his memory, and I said only that I had been the one to dress him for burial, and that I had something I needed to ask his mother. I did not mention the note. I did not mention the warmth. I only asked. Months passed. I had nearly given up. And then, in the spring of 2007, a woman telephoned me, and it was Antonia Salzano, Carlo's mother, and her voice was gentle and tired, and full of a strange steadiness that I have only ever heard in people who have suffered something enormous and come out the other side still believing. We spoke for a long time. I told her, carefully, that her son's body had not behaved as bodies do. I told her about the warmth, the 29 degrees, the absence of the smell. I expected her to weep, or to grow angry, or to dismiss me. She did none of those things. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said that she was not surprised, and then she said the sentence I have carried ever since. She said that in the last week of his life, Carlo had told her that after he died, a woman would dress him, a woman who did not believe, and that this woman would be afraid of her own hands, and that I was to tell her, when she came, that her hands were clean. I could not speak. I held the telephone and I could not make a single sound, and on the other end, Antonia waited, because she was a woman who had learned to wait, through silences far heavier than mine. When I could finally speak, I asked her how he could have known, how a 15-year-old boy dying of leukemia could have described in advance a stranger he would never meet and the exact private shape of her fear. And she said simply that Carlo had known a great many things in those last days, that he had spoken of the future the way other people speak of the past, calmly, as a thing already settled, that he had told her not to be sad on the day of his beatification because there would be roses, and that he had told her there would be a long road and that she would walk it in many countries, telling people about him. She told me that he had said one more thing about me, and that she had not understood it then, but that she would tell it to me now, because perhaps I would understand it better than she had. He had said that the woman who dressed him would one day find herself in a hospital again, on her knees, in a place with green walls and a window full of light, and that on that day she would finally read what he had left in his pocket, and that she would no longer be afraid of her hands or of anything. The green walls, the window full of light, the hospital from my dreams. I had not told Antonia about the dreams. I had told no one, and here she was, repeating her dead son's words from years before, describing the exact room my sleeping mind had wandered through 3 nights running, down to the light in the window. I sat down on the floor of my workshop, with the telephone still pressed to my ear, and Bottone came and pushed his head against my arm, and I understood, finally and completely, that I was inside something that had been arranged before I knew it existed. I asked Antonia one question more. I asked when. When would I be in that hospital? And she said her son had not given her a date for that one. He had only said that I would know the place when I saw it, and that I should keep the paper sealed until then, because the paper was for that day and not for any day before it. So I kept it sealed. For years more, I kept it sealed. The note went back into the drawer with my mother's thimble, and I went back to my life. But it was not the same life, because now I knew the shape of the thing I was waiting for, and I lived in a kind of quiet expectation, watching every hospital I passed for green walls and a window full of light. The years went by the way years do. I kept working. I kept the appointment I did not yet have. In 2019, I read in the paper that they had exhumed Carlo's body in Assisi, as the church does when it examines a candidate for sainthood, and that they had found it intact enough to display, and that thousands of people were lining up to file past a boy in jeans and trainers who looked as though he were only sleeping. In jeans and trainers, the same clothes. I thought of my hands on that jacket. I thought of the note that had pressed against my fingers through the lining. In 2020, they beatified him on the 10th of October, and Antonia had said there would be roses, and there were roses. I watched it on a small television in my workshop, and I wept, the way you weep when something you were promised comes true. But I had still not found the green room. I was 63 years old by then, and I had begun, in my weaker moments, to wonder whether the last promise would simply go unfulfilled, whether I would die with the paper still sealed in the drawer and never know what it said. I was wrong about that. The green room was coming. It came in the worst possible way, and it came fast. It was the winter of 2021, and I had a pain in my chest that I had been ignoring for too long, the way stubborn people do. And one gray morning in February, it stopped being a pain I could ignore. It took me in the workshop, mid-stitch, and the needle dropped from my hand, and the floor came up toward me. And the last thing I remember thinking was that I had not fed Bottone. The neighbor heard me fall. That is the only reason I am alive to tell you this. She had a key. She called the ambulance. I came back to myself in motion, in the back of the ambulance, with an oxygen mask over my face and the siren going, and then there were lights and ceilings sliding past and voices saying numbers, my blood pressure, my heart rate, 90/50, a heart rhythm they did not like. They told me later it had been a heart attack, and that a vessel had been most of the way closed, and that I had come very near the edge of it. They took me into a procedure to open the vessel, And it worked, and they wheeled me afterward into a recovery room to rest, and I was drifting in the gray place between the medicine and sleep when I opened my eyes and looked at the wall. The wall was pale green. I turned my head, slowly, because everything was heavy, and there was a long window along the far side of the room, and through it the winter sun was coming in, low and bright, a window full of light. I lay there and I could not breathe, and this time it was not my heart. I looked at the door of the room, and there was a number on it, and the number was 412, something with a 4 in it. The thing I had almost read in the dream and never could. I started to cry, weakly, into the thin hospital pillow. A nurse came and asked if I was in pain, and I shook my head, because I was not in pain. I was at the end of a road that had been laid down for me before I understood that I was walking it. I asked her, when I could speak, what hospital this was. She told me. It was not San Gerardo. It was a hospital in another city entirely, the one nearest to where the ambulance had been routed that morning, because of where the beds were free. No one had chosen it. A computer had chosen it, the way a man on a telephone had once chosen me, almost at random, 15 years before. And I thought of Carlo, who had loved computers, and I almost laughed through the tears, because, of course it would be this way. I asked the nurse for my coat. My things had come with me in the ambulance. The neighbor had thought to grab my bag. And in the bag, where it had lived for years because I could not bear to leave it behind anymore, where I had carried it from drawer to bag, the way you carry a thing you are waiting to need, was the folded paper. I held it in both hands. 14 years I had carried it. 14 years I had not opened it because a dead boy had asked me not to, until the day with the green walls and the window full of light. The day had come. I unfolded it slowly, along the creases worn soft by all those years. My hands were not shaking. That is the thing I remember most. After 14 years of being afraid of my own hands, they were perfectly still as I opened the paper, as if they had finally learned what the boy had tried to tell them. Inside, in the same rounded blue ink, was a short message. I am going to tell you exactly what it said, every word, because every word was true. It said, "To Renata Bianchi, you are reading this in the hospital, on the day your own heart almost stopped, in the room with the green walls. Today is the day you stop being afraid. Your hands dressed me with such care. They are good hands, and they are clean hands, and God has seen every careful thing they ever did. I asked you to wait so that you would know on this day that none of it was chance. Not the warmth you measured, not the silence you smelled, not the road that brought you here. Tell them what you saw. The Eucharist was my highway to heaven. Yours runs through your 2 hands. Do not be afraid. Carlo." My name, my full name, Renata Bianchi, written in the hand of a boy who died 2 days before anyone alive knew I would be the one to dress him. The green walls, the day my heart almost stopped, named in advance, before the heart attack, before the ambulance, before the computer that chose this room. The warmth I had measured with my own thermometer, the silence I had smelled, all of it, named, on a paper folded into his jacket in the autumn of 2006. I lay in that bed with the paper against my chest, and I did the only thing left to do. I prayed. Not the stumbling, half-remembered prayer of the night after the dressing, a real one that came up out of me whole, in a voice that did not fail. The first voice that had not failed me in 14 years. And here is the thing I most need you to understand. From that day, my voice came back, fully. The whisper that had haunted me since the mortuary, the failing that no doctor could find a cause for, was simply gone, as if it had been held in trust all those years, for the day I would have something true to say. I am an old woman now, and I have spent the years since that hospital room telling this story to anyone who will listen, in parishes and in halls, and once, to my own astonishment, before men from the church who were gathering testimonies, who listened to me with grave faces and wrote down my numbers. 29 degrees at the core, the absence of the smell, the note that named me before I was chosen. They did not tell me what they made of it. That is not for me to know. I only told the truth, which is the only thing I have ever had to give. In September of 2025, in the Jubilee year, the Church canonized Carlo Acutis. They named him a saint. The first saint of his generation, they are calling him. The boy of the internet. The one who used the things of this modern world to point at the oldest thing of all. I was there, an old seamstress in the crowd, with the folded paper in my coat pocket over my own healed heart. And when they spoke his name, I wept again. And this time, there was no fear in it at all. I have thought often about why it was me, a woman who believed in thread. I think it was precisely because I believed in nothing else, because I measured things, because when I felt the warmth, I did not simply feel it. I took out my thermometer and I wrote down the number, 26.1, and then 29, and I kept the record, and the record could not lie, even when I wanted it to. He needed a witness who would not be content to feel. He needed one who would measure. And I think somehow that boy knew that the woman who would dress him was exactly that kind of woman, and that her stubborn, doubting, record-keeping hands were the right hands for the task. They are good hands, he said. They are clean. If this testimony has marked you the way that day in the green room marked the whole of my life, I ask you one thing. Subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone carrying a loss or a doubt or a fear of their own hands. On this channel, we keep gathering the traces Carlo left across the world, the true ones, the ones that do not fit inside what we thought was possible. And if you want to carry something of this story with you, the free novena to Carlo Acutis is in the description, the first link below this video. Pray it, share it, and keep his memory alive. Carlo said the Eucharist was his highway to heaven. The traces of heaven are everywhere, on green walls and folded papers, and in a measurement that should not have been. You only have to know how to look.